Good afternoon, everyone. We'll just give it a 30 seconds or so to let everyone get in, and then we'll get started. Okay, right, 1 minute past. Let's get going as a few more people arrive. So welcome everyone to this afternoon's webinar on a local authority perspective on statistical significance testing for road safety. So this is part 2 of the current series that we're doing. Hopefully many of you managed to make it to part 1, and maybe that's why you're here for part 2, because you got something out of the first part. Part 1, Drishti, one of my colleagues, and myself talked through fairly high level a few of the kind of pitfalls and principles of stats testing as a bit of a kind of tee up for multiple future parts, of which this is the first. So today we're joined by Oscar Freeman-Davies from Devon County Council. So Oscar's going to present to us on his context in Devon. As usual, please do make use of the chat and the Q&A throughout. So we should have some time at the end for questions. So please do put those in the Q&A throughout the webinar. Also, please use the chat throughout the webinar to comment on anything you're seeing, or to have your own conversations about interesting things if you prefer, but relating to road safety, please. And then, yeah, we'll get those questions sent through to Oscar at the end and have a bit of a conversation. I'll also jump in with some comments and questions throughout his presentation to keep the discussion flowing. Okay, right, Oscar, over to you. Do you want to introduce yourself and then get going?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Nathan. I'm Oscar Freeman-Davies. For those who haven't met me before, I work at Devon County Council within the road safety team. A bit about my background is I did a degree in environmental science and geology, and sort of have moved into the road safety world, completing a master's in transport planning and engineering, where I focused on cyclist safety in the Southwest, specifically a statistical analysis of these characteristics. And hopefully today I'm going to walk you through a bit of a scenario that we see all the time in local authority, how we can apply statistical testing to this scenario, and as well for some more future development, we've also got a section where I'll be going over how you can integrate multiple different forms of stats testing into things like Power BI, so you can really simplify your answers. So without further ado, I'll make a start and just get things going. So always, what is the problem? For those of you who don't work in local authority, we receive large numbers of questions around road safety from all sorts of different people. Is it getting better or worse? Have any of your interventions worked? What are you doing about that junction? And some of these questions can appear quite vague at the start, but actually it's quite clear to me that there's a lot going under the surface, and we can really dig into what they're meaning here. We also receive a lot of unqualified statements as well. This isn't just from members of the public, but also from councillors. Last year was really bad for motorcyclists, one I hear all the time. There's a large amount of reaction to especially media sensitive crashes, and that can skew people's perception of how a whole year has been. Cyclists are safer since COVID, really broad sweeping statements that people believe. And then one of my favorites, it's people from outside Devon are the problem. So they don't believe that locals ever crash on our roads. And through the data, we can sort of prove that isn't the case. How do we answer these questions? It's a really big one. And I think there are many ways you can go about it, your own personal knowledge, your own feelings about this. But coming from a sort of data background, I would always suggest using data facts and figures and testing. Okay, before we get into statistical testing and what we're going to be doing to get those information out, what should we do first? Define the question. I think this is absolutely key when you're firstly looking at collision or casualty data and you're trying to be aware of what you're answering. Some people really conflate casualties and collisions, the difference between significant changes and trends, all sorts of confusion here that really makes a big difference when you're trying to pinpoint what they're asking for. As Nathan nicely went over in the first series of this webinar, descriptive statistics are a fantastic place to start. This can be really simple in terms of ranges, bar charts, percentage changes, really just that high level look at your data where you can start to identify some of the trends and make yourself familiar with what that data is telling you. And for specific requests, this may well be enough. If people are asking for absolute figures on last year's stats, that might well do. After you've really nailed down these first 2 points, it's appropriate to start thinking about what statistical test might be of use for you here. If you have done any statistical testing, please feel free to put it in the chat. I'm always keen to hear what you're doing. And if you can make a note whether you're a local authority or what company you're from, that would be really helpful, just so we know who's sort of at these meetings.
Sorry, Oscar, can I just jump in on that last slide, actually? So this is something that I personally find it's very easy, if you think you're going to end up doing some stats, to jump straight to the stats rather than explore your data first. And actually, I find until you get into the data, until you know what questions you're trying to ask of that data, and you do some descriptive stats to understand the nuances of it, what's going on, what am I seeing, what looks interesting, what questions am I really trying to answer here, then you can start to formulate what kind of stats you might need to support that. And to me, the statistics should always support what you're seeing in the data rather than some other way around. So you see something in the data, you think there's something going on here. I need some evidence that this isn't just random chance. Okay, I need to use stats to support that.
Absolutely. And as you say, there can be circumstances where you might want to match the test to get a particular answer out. And certainly, you've got to take that high level approach, understand what you're dealing with first. And I always come back to people who question me for data because every word matters. If you say motorcycle rider casualties or motorcycle riders, that is a different value that we're going to have to extract. So there really is nuance in this field, and making it crystal clear what you're reporting on and what you're getting out of the data is imperative to begin with. So thank you, Nathan. What is statistical testing? We can summarize it in a really formal manner here. We can evaluate whether the observed data are compatible with a null hypothesis, producing test statistics and summary measures. If you're not a statistician, though, does this make sense? I've got a diagram here. I find things a bit easier to visualize like this, but still, this is a lot of jargon that isn't necessarily clear to a lot of people. What does a null hypothesis mean? Why might you not accept it in this large middle area here? As I say, this can be unclear if you're not familiar with the terms. I like to think about these terms and these values as sort of thoughts and feelings that you might be having around your data. So if we take H0 or the null hypothesis, very broadly speaking, we could say that there has been no change in our collision statistics between COVID and present day, and that would be a null hypothesis. And quite conversely, the alternative is the converse, whether that's true or not, but we would be trying to work out whether the collision casualty stats have significantly changed since COVID. I think hypothesis testing is certainly the easiest place to begin in terms of statistical tests. Things like t-tests are really useful in terms of just answering that black or white. Has something changed? And again, I think this is a really great point to start asking questions and coming up with your own ideas for your data. If you speak to colleagues within your organizations, I'm sure they'll have their own thoughts, feelings, and preconceptions around what the data is telling them and what they believe to be true. And I think it's clear that at this stage, there are no wrong answers. It's completely reasonable to come up with a hypothesis that you might disprove later down the line. So don't be afraid of making a statement in the first place and then getting data and potentially disproving your own statement. Some of these definitions, just in case people aren't fully aware of what we're doing, the null hypothesis, again, this is the assumption that there hasn't been a difference or there hasn't been a change observed in the data, and that any changes are actually the result of random fluctuation or potential regression. As I've mentioned, the alternative hypothesis is the converse of that. The significance level, this is the probability that we sort of use to say when rejecting our null hypothesis that the opposite is true. So we can say with a 5% or greater certainty, there has been a significant change since COVID. And then just to finish off, there's a few technical terms here, a test statistic, which is computed again to determine whether or not we reject our hypothesis. And the p-value is actually the probability in its numerical format that comes out of the end of a Poisson distribution, allowing you to sort of accurately or not determine whether the changes were significant. Okay, why are we doing this? What is the point of statistical testing? I've touched on it briefly before in terms of, have we got our initial questions? Have we created any descriptive statistics? And is there a need to determine significance? As I say, sometimes these queries can be answered without that. However, there are some really typical questions that I certainly receive a lot that would really benefit from a statistical grounding in the response. Was last year significantly worse than the previous years? The word significant is thrown around a huge amount. And again, please be careful if you're using it and if you're responding to it, because it means different things to different people. Are our collisions and casualties decreasing because of certain factors? Are particular road users being in crashes that have certain characteristics that appear more frequently than others? This might seem like quite a complicated question, but when you start to dig into the data, it can become clear that particular road users suffer particular crash types more often than not. An example I can think of would be motorcyclists and cyclists losing control. That might have an impact on the severity of injury that they receive. And again, these are all things that can be explored throughout statistical testing. Do particular routes have characteristics that might influence our interventions or enforcements? A really key one, particularly for us in Devon, with such a large rural road network, the distinction between the crashes that happen on that network and those that happen in our urban centres are naturally quite different, and we need to treat those almost as categorical in terms of that they're separate from each other and they don't really have the same characteristics. I'm going to briefly touch now on some benefits and experiences that I've experienced at Devon County Council throughout statistical testing, what it's helped me improve, and some challenges that I faced around it. It has allowed me to confidently respond to people and produce reports that really clearly indicate where changes are significant and where they're potentially borderline, or perhaps where there has been no change at all and the numbers are just varying naturally. A quantitative approach has certainly, from my perspective, removed a lot of the personal aspect that surrounds collision data. It's an incredibly sensitive topic, and being able to come back with a response that is not only based in facts, but also has that statistical weight to it is really useful in terms of explaining my decision making. I touched on this before, but a reduction in bias and uncertainty. Everybody has preconceptions around what they think is happening on the roads, and not everybody has a grounding in data. So this really helps us squash some of those preconceptions and misinterpretations that people have, especially around short-term trends. A real benefit that we've seen not only in Devon, but also as part of Vision Zero Southwest is the scalability and repeatability of statistical testing. Once these have been set up, they're really easily duplicated, replicated, and put into many different formats. This allows us to really handle large data sets and very quickly spit out responses that have had statistical tests performed, compared to having to individually run these on a case-by-case basis. And the final two, allowing for robust evaluation and control for exposure. We've been able to identify different areas across our road network that need to be treated differently in terms of our statistical approach. And we're able to back up our answers with factual data in terms of what we might expect to see, what we're actually seeing on the ground, and whether those differences are indeed significant. On to some challenges. As I mentioned, there can be a real variance in terms of the familiarity with statistics and the people that you speak to working in local authority. Some people have told me, well, what's the point? I can see that this year has more figures, more casualties than last year. That means it's gotten worse. And that can be a very difficult conversation to have, to explain to people that there are longer term factors at play. It's really quite difficult, especially if you have predefined tests set up, that you don't miss out when your data source changes. As you'll all be aware, we're in the transition to the new stats format, and whilst most areas are reporting on it, there have been changes to key fields. The factors are all completely new. There are new serious categories, and as an authority who haven't backfilled their historic data with those new categories, that means that we now have a partially completed year and no previous data. So that would make statistical testing quite tricky if you were to just take those base categories out of an Excel spreadsheet, for example. The misinterpretation of statistics and significance, as I say, people throw out the word significant all the time, and it doesn't mean what they think it means. A trend is not the same as a significant decrease, and I always do challenge people when they put those words in their reports. We have to be aware of the data quality issues surrounding Stats 19 and your own local issues as well. It's quite known in the UK there's an underreporting of cycle and pedestrian collisions. This might have an impact on the robustness of your tests because of large amounts of variance and not being able to accurately say that this was the amount of data that was present. And again, something that's quite key is small counts and small values can be incredibly tricky when you're trying to glean statistical significance from them, just due to the high level of variance. That's true for all collision data, as there are naturally a lot of external factors that impact the data set. Why crashes occur is a really complicated question, but certainly something you need to be aware of when choosing a particular test to use.
And just to jump in again, Oscar, on this, I think
please,
these kind of challenges are really important for us to be aware of, but they shouldn't put us off using
exactly.
statistics. There are loads of benefits, and I think it's important that we're aware of these, because it means that if we're not, we can then use statistics in a bad way, or present results that actually aren't kind of well formed, particularly things around if you know there's a lot of uncertainty in your data in terms of levels of reporting or in terms of what the actual values are. If you go away and do a stats test on that, actually there might be a lot of uncertainty in terms of what you're saying. So things to note and things to make sure that we're kind of accounting for, but certainly shouldn't be putting us off.
I completely agree. It's always a balance to be struck between, how can we accurately report on what we need to, whilst also including that sort of robustness that backs up our statements at the end of it. Thank you, Nathan. So I'm going to move on now to our approach as Devon County Council, what we sort of do, and I'll take us through a bit of a demonstration on a completely fabricated story that I've made up that a councillor might ask you for, and just go into how we might start answering that question and at the end produce statistical significance values to support our answer. I've mentioned this a few times already. We have to define the question. If somebody sends me a really woolly worded question, I won't start. I have to know exactly what they're asking for. Step one, descriptive statistics. We have to get exactly what is happening with our data understood first before we can jump into any sort of tests. We use a lot of Poisson significance tests across Devon to compare the latest year data with both 10-year averages and pre-COVID averages. There are some caveats towards these, but this is a really helpful and really good way to get involved in statistical data to begin with. As I touched on earlier, we do have quite a few essentially different areas in Devon, rural and urban, so we take more of a categorical approach using chi-squared analysis here, and I will touch on this when we get into our Power BI demonstration later. And then finally, we don't just use one piece of software for this, and there isn't just a one size fits all for everybody. We use a combination of Excel, Power BI, SQL. You can also use things like Python, R, SPSS. There is a huge amount of statistical software and code out there that can really make your life easier when you're trying to just get started. Okay, we're now going to try and work through an example of when statistical testing might be appropriate and how we might approach that as a local authority. Again, excuse my storytelling, it's not my speciality, it's why I'm working in data and road safety, but we've been asked a question from councillor blogs, and they've said, have casualties from RTCs, that's road traffic collisions, changed significantly across Devon recently? What do we do first? So immediately, I'm not super happy with the question they've asked me, but what I would do here is ask them to define a time period and ensure that they do actually mean significantly. Do they mean, have they changed at all? You know, are they just looking for a year-on-year increase, or potentially are they looking for that something deeper to go back to a transferred assessment with, or to sort of help bolster a local plan? Okay. For me, I'm always dealing firstly with validated data, and you can access this either through the DFT's data tool, or you should have your own local databases. The police will also have their own database, and this would be a really good point to actually take stock of what you have, what the DFT have, and what the police have, and just do a review, because there will always be discrepancies between your data sets. And depending on which one you use, you may well get a member of the public or a really keen colleague sort of challenge you and say, well, actually, I've got different figures for your area. Why have you decided to choose those? And just having that reasoning in your back pocket is going to be really useful later on when you're able to explain, I used my local data set because I make changes to it after the DFT have, and the police may include additional damage onlys in theirs, as an example. So firstly, this is our casualty figures from Devon across the latest 5 years. The crude arrows here are sort of showing if there was an increase or a decrease year on year. And just for some more visual users on the call, this is what that looks like in a chart. So we can see here that in my opinion, this is a relatively stable looking picture. The figures have fluctuated slightly, peaking in 2021 before falling to a low in 2023 and then rising again last year. As I've said, this isn't a huge amount of information, and I wouldn't be happy going back with this to say with any significance or certainty that there was a reduction or an increase in our levels here. Let's see if we can perform some additional calculations and to see whether these changes are potentially significant and whether we require a statistical test. So this is just a slightly different layout. We've got the years along the top, and along the right-hand side, I've calculated some percentage changes, as I've mentioned, from a previous control period, pre-COVID, 2017 to 2019, a percentage change, should read from 2020, and then a percentage change from 2020 to 2024 from 2023. So we can see that looking at our 5-year period, there's been a small increase of about 6% with the latest year compared. But when we looked back at our control period, there was actually a large reduction that was observed. What does this mean? Why might there have been a reduction in our pre-COVID period? Should we investigate this further? Let's have a look at the data. Our 10-year figures appear on chart here. And again, we're looking at a very mixed picture, up and down, but there is a clear change here between 2019 and 2020. And the figures, when we look at that on a line chart, do appear to have remained below, in potentially significant terms, from our 2015 to 2019 period. Both 5-year periods showed small reductions in casualty numbers, but when you start looking at this as a 10-year period, it appears that there has been a significant reduction. In my opinion, this would probably be worth taking towards a statistical test. And this is the type of progression that I would perform for most queries that I receive, taking that recent picture, expanding it back a bit further to see whether things have changed, and then ultimately, and again based on the question, deciding to proceed with a statistical test.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting one, Oscar, because I mean, often we work with kind of standard ideas like, oh, we need to use a 3-year baseline, or oh, we need to look at a 5-year period, etc. But actually with this one, if you look at a 5-year period, then there's not too much change. If you look at a previous 5-year period, there's a big jump there. So I think this shows the value of not just necessarily sticking to your standard procedure of let's do 3 years, let's do 5 years, but look at the data holistically and think, what am I seeing and why might this be happening? And therefore, what should my approach be in terms of number of years and samples, etc.?
I completely agree, Nathan. And it's not, to say that a 3-year period or a 5-year period isn't useful in another context. It's just taking into account, I was asked here, what's the picture in Devon? If I was asked, what's happened more recently, I would certainly be changing my parameters. But it is, I always try and say, road safety is a holistic discipline. What we do, no matter what it is in terms of impact on the road, might impact road safety as well. So taking as much data in as possible when I'm just trying to figure out what's going on is certainly, how I would approach this. Okay, we're going to now move on towards statistical testing. What should you do? Why should you do it? And what are some of the things that you should probably look out for when you're doing them? So we identified from our earlier statistics that there does seem to be a reduction in 10-year total casualties, observed quite clearly from the line chart, but again, 2 distinct 5-year periods perhaps wouldn't have shown that. So something worth keeping an eye on. We'd like to work out whether these changes are statistically significant or if they're a result of random variation. I do appreciate, for the keen statisticians in the chat, COVID is a very unique event that had unprecedented impact on the road network, but it's certainly something I think we should be investigating, especially as we're now appearing back to normal traffic flow levels, yet collisions and casualties are remaining below what they were previously. So this will require a statistical test. Which one? If you've been paying attention, you may well be able to guess, but if not, no worries, because there are a multitude that you could probably do for this piece of work. What I'm going to talk you through is a Poisson distribution, and hopefully how you might set up one of these, why it might be useful to you, and as well as some of the general assumptions or caveats that you need to take with this data test. Why is it useful? Why are we doing this? It helps us to determine whether the changes were a result of random fluctuation in the data, or if they were the result of something significant happening. I find that this can be useful to establish a statistical baseline or norm to compare with in the future. If you take a relatively stable few years, as we've done with our pre-COVID average, we sort of had a good idea that our casualties were on a path, and comparing our changes against that period is really useful to determine what might have made that impact in the future. It's scalable over both time, temporally, and geographically. This is really useful in terms of you can look not only at Devon County Council's data as a whole, you could do a Poisson distribution at a cluster site location. The values might well be lower, but across a 10-year period, you should have enough data points to be able to make some of those changes. I really find this quite useful in terms of responding to councillors, but this can help provide you with a ranking or an objective fact that something has gotten a lot worse or a lot better in recent years. This is very useful when councillors are pressured by their constituents in terms of trying to get solutions and interventions where they live, where the data may not necessarily support that. It's really helpful for me to be able to say there are no statistical changes at these sites. I've got X number of sites where there are changes that are statistically worse, and that is why we're not focusing on the areas that you've said. Poisson distribution I would describe as almost the first step towards regression modeling, and certainly if the data doesn't quite fit, it's really useful to be able to pivot to do these regression models. I'm sure this will be touched upon in future webinars, Nathan, I hope, and it's very useful in terms of assigning some weight towards variables and how they might have impacted the crashes or particular circumstances on a network. So traffic volume, speed limits, junction types could be really useful and interesting to see a regression model for the Wales 20-mile-an-hour zones. I'd be really keen to see how that comes out, whether it's had an impact or not. As with all statistical tests, there are caveats, things you need to be aware of, and some assumptions that you're making if you're doing some tests that should be checked. Small counts are going to provide high levels of uncertainty and potentially not give you the statistical answer you're looking for. I would always counteract this by saying if you can get more years data, the better. And if you can be relatively confident that that data is normally distributed, that's also going to give you a really good weight towards that as well. We assume independence of collisions. This obviously might not always be true. There are certain factors that do contribute to more collisions. A really heavy snowstorm on the A30 might cause a 4-car pileup and 2 crashes. Those types of related collision are something to be aware of, but certainly I wouldn't let that put you off starting out your statistical journey. And then Underestimating over dispersion is a couple of really long words in there, but essentially what that means is when you have quite high variance in your collision data, it's a lot harder to statistically say that your changes were a result of X reason. A Poisson distribution doesn't go into that detail, but it's really useful to link that to a regression model to say, actually, the collision numbers have fallen, but it wasn't because of the junction types, or it wasn't because of the speed limit. And those are the types of answers you get maybe at sort of step 2 or step 3 in terms of a statistical test.
Yeah, just to comment on that as well, Oscar. I mean,
yeah, please.
Many of you will have heard the quote that all no models are perfect, but all models are useful. Some models are useful. That's it.
Yeah.
It's the same with this. The Poisson distribution falls out really nicely as being something we can use when we're looking at collision data, because it's used to model count data. And of course, when we're looking at collisions, typically we're looking at a number of collisions in a fixed time interval, a day, a year, whatever. And so it's quite handy to be able to use that theory that comes with the Poisson distribution and do Poisson testing. But of course, as you said, there are limitations. I mean, independence is something we generally assume, but we have to be quite careful of that in different situations. So I think this is definitely a useful way of trying to understand collision data, but also there are limitations. It's not perfect. I guess you mentioned the normal distribution there. I don't know if you're going to get to this, but I think where the normal distribution comes in, and typically with collision data over a big time frame or a wide geographical space, we've got quite a lot of numbers. And so when you've got big numbers, the Poisson distribution looks very much like the normal distribution, and then we can use normal distribution theory. So those two distributions, Poisson and normal, are quite handy in terms of comparing year on year and that kind of thing. I think we lost you for a minute there, Oscar. Are you back?
I am back. Sorry, Nathan. You cut out right as you just said the Poisson and the normal distribution ...
Oh, okay. The Poisson and the normal distribution are particularly useful for this kind of analysis. Anyway, I'll pass back to you.
No, thank you. And you're absolutely right. It's certainly something I've mentioned throughout this presentation, that large numbers help these distributions and small ones are going to have much higher levels of variance. But it is, as you say, partly down to the usability of the sort of Poisson test that you're able to get out meaningful responses with, natural caveats around what we may have assumed. I'm going to touch briefly now on how you might perform a Poisson distribution test. And again, there are many ways that you could do this. I think the first place I ever did this was in SPSS, a piece of statistical analysis software, really useful for being able to put in a large amount of data and press the button and it will run the tests for you. Microsoft Excel formula is what I'm going to be showing you today, and this is from a ROSPA accredited spreadsheet, which is really useful in terms of just getting you started with what statistics you can use. There are, of course, multiple other ways in terms of Power BI, DAX, and I'm sure you can write code in Python and R that would also create these distributions. Excuse the horrible looking jargon at the top and the spoilers that you may or may not be seeing, but this is how the spreadsheet appears, and it's really quite useful, giving you a mean or average accidents per year. The significance value is the previous statistic p-value that I mentioned earlier, and we've got a nice handy statement that's generated for us in terms of whether it is an acceptable degree of confidence or not. It's a brief bit of DAX for you there for any Power BI nerds on the chat. So how do we use this data to respond to our initial query? You can see at the top here, I've just got that back on screen, but my main point would be to keep it simple. You don't need to tell them the formula that you've used to calculate this data. You probably don't need to go into what different significance levels mean. ultimately, in this example, what the council is asking for is, was it a significant change or not in the recent period? Understanding your audience is key, as I've said. A headline answer could well be casualties have fallen significantly when compared with our 10-year average using a Poisson distribution if required. This is something that succinctly summarizes what we have done in a statistical sense, and it's something that a member of the public could understand. If I turned around and said this had a 0.0021 significance level at 95% confidence intervals, that doesn't mean much to people. So we really have to be careful not to turn people off. Be aware of your caveats and shortcomings. As I say, it's really useful to be able to go back to them and say, this was computed using our data, or this was computed using the national data set. A really big key part of statistical testing is the repeatability. Can you give somebody your data set and they will go back and get exactly the same results? That's a really useful tool to be able to validate your work and future work going forwards. I'm going to move on now, with the interests of time, to a bit more of a section on advanced analysis and combination of statistical tests in Power BI. What we're looking at here at the top is an excerpt from our high harm routes. And again, what I've tried to show here is a difference between what you might typically see on a high harm route and what you're actually seeing on this one. This is for an urban route, and we can see that the cyclist percentage is in red here. That's going to indicate a statistically higher level of cyclists than I would have expected to see on this road. A lot of these are created using measures in Power BI. Again, measures, for those who don't know, is essentially just little pieces of code that allow you to do calculations across multiple reports and save you having to rewrite it in Excel every time you want to do a year-on-year change, your cumulative totals, your observed versus expected, or even your Poisson tests. You can create all of these in Power BI. As I've said, this is perhaps quite far down the line, but it shows you how we're comparing not only our 10-year trends, but also with our pre-COVID average control period as well. So it's really useful to have those two answers, as you were saying, Nathan, in terms of those shorter time periods, to say, actually, our longer time period is looking stable, but when we compare to that control group, it's looking a little worse. And again, just a very simple piece of DAX for you there on how you calculate KSI collisions and ensuring that you're getting all the new serious categories as well. Again, I'm going to hopefully now show you some of these differences and why they are so useful for us. I'm just going to move it across my screen. And please, Nathan, if you can't see this, just let me know.
Can see that.
Excellent. So what we are looking at here, I think I will actually go back and choose one. This is what I wanted to see. On route map. On the right-hand side, we can see we have a route performance category ranked from worst to best. And what I'm going to do is come along, click on one of our routes, and information is going to appear up here. As I mentioned earlier, we've tried to distinguish between our urban and rural network due to the massive differences in collision characteristics. And we can see that our ranking here on the top right, firstly, is comparing it to all routes in Devon and Cornwall, so that's including urban ones. And then secondly, we can see that we're comparing it to rural routes only, and it actually scores much worse when we make that distinction. When we drill into the detailed stats, as I described, statistically significant percentages are going to appear in red. And when I hover over this, what we can see, and apologies, it's so small for the people, it's saying actual number recorded 6, that's motorcycle casualties, and the norm for rural routes is about 17%. So we are calculating what we would expect to see on a rural route in terms of motorcycle collisions. We've calculated what we've seen on this route, and we can work out that that is significantly higher. Again, this has been really useful working alongside the police and Vision Zero to challenge those preconceptions and to say, you're telling me that's a really bad motorcycle route, the data doesn't support it. Or in this case, it does support it. And again, we've got that nice 5-year picture as well to see whether these changes are consistent or whether interventions that we might have delivered are beginning to have an impact. I'm going to quickly touch on to our casualty summary and the trends that I have described with our Poisson test. And again, I'm just going to flash up the legend here. A red flag shows a significant increase compared to our 10-year average. And an amber flag would be a borderline significant change. And a green flag would be a significant decrease in collisions. And to me, it's really interesting to see that while some road user groups here are looking remarkably steady on the line chart, when you actually look at the data, for example, cyclists, we can see that this has been a significant reduction compared to our 10-year trend and compared to our pre-COVID average. So this is really useful for, again, answering whatever the councillor might say in terms of cyclists are being hurt more frequently in my area. I can then turn around and say, actually, that's not the case at all. And this is all completely built in and automatically refreshed with the latest data. So I'm not having to, run this test, for however many vehicle groups I have. And I want to sort of come to a bit of a close with some questions for you. What can you do in the future? How much insight can you get from your data? There's a huge amount to explore in road safety, casualty and collision data, and what I've touched on today is certainly a high level approach in terms of getting some of those trends down. But how much can you dig into that detail? Can you find out what characteristics of crashes are making cyclists hurt a bit more? Why are your figures changing year on year? Is it your schemes or is it random? It's those types of questions we need to ask ourselves. And finally, how are we getting started? Generate those descriptive statistics, get your question defined. I'd recommend reaching out to anyone who's done ROSPA training to try and play around with a spreadsheet, see if you can get some statistics in there, and always double check with people. Query what you're finding. Does this make sense? As always, we have to plug the Agilicis webinar series. I found the first episode really useful, and hopefully this is as well. Ask for help. There's nothing to be ashamed of if you don't know where to begin or what you might have to do to even get started. So please, if you don't ask, you don't get. And then there's plenty of online resources as well. DFT, RAC, huge numbers of papers that have been written about statistical testing on collision data, and certainly a wealth of information if you're interested. And that comes to the end of what I had to say. So thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Oscar. That was great. So I asked Oscar to bring us a local authority perspective in this webinar, specifically, what are they doing in the Southwest? How are they using stats tests? What kind of questions are they answering? What are their experiences of benefits and challenges of that? Really in the hope, I guess, that particularly those of you that work in local authorities that deal with these kind of questions, that have this data, that want to be doing more stats testing, you might be able to get some ideas from this, and that this might prompt more discussions and more use of stats, particularly within the local authority space. I'm not currently seeing any questions in the Q&A, so feel free to put any in there. But I'll kick off with one for you, Oscar. Mm-hmm. If I am somebody who works in a local authority and thinks, actually, I want to be building in more as routine analysis some of these kinds of statistical tests. Two things. Firstly, where can I start with that? Secondly, why should I do that? I know you talk quite a lot about that, but I guess summarizing again, like why should I bother doing that as opposed to just looking at the trends year on year?
I think those are both great questions, Nathan, and certainly from the why, I would say it probably depends on your current position. If you're a road safety manager and you're interested in getting more capital funding or more input from additional teams in your directorates or councils, it might be really helpful to tell them this site is getting significantly worse over the last 10 years. We need to improve it right now. If you're in more of a data analyst role, it might be really helpful to provide your managers with a full list of sites that they're concerned about with that breakdown. Is it change? Is it as bad as you think? Does the data support your assumptions or not? And where to start is a fantastic question. I think people can be intimidated around statistics, and it's something that you have just got to get in there. I would recommend starting with the ROSPA Excel spreadsheet and the associated paper that I've seen around that, in terms of just getting an understanding of why you're doing this testing. As I said, there are no wrong answers at the beginning of this. It's really useful to be able to say to people, I tried this, I thought this, and I got the converse. It wasn't true. That is almost certainly the first step.
Thanks. Question in the chat. You touched on various data sets. How would you recommend integrating multiple sources? Great question. And how could the stats kind of work around that?
Yeah, fascinating. And it's probably something that I would hope other people are already working on, because I want to ask the same questions. In terms of how you might build them in, I think once you perhaps have identified a problem or a concern in terms of, okay, I want to look at cycle collisions, they're getting significantly worse. At that point, I would start to break it down and think, okay, what do I know about cycle collisions that might be impacting these changes? Is it the weather? Is it the speed limit? Or is it potentially the age of the people involved in these collisions? Once you start to extract that data, and again, this is all in Stats 19, you're able to start working on some of those binomial regressions that I touched on earlier, and things like odds ratios that allow you to actually compare whether what you're seeing is what you expect to see. And I think that's a really key point to make, is that actually sometimes you'll think there's a problem and you'll think it's that, and it's going to come back and not be true, which of course is not a problem, but just having that robustness in your response, I think, is really crucial.
Great. Okay. So Liz mentioned in the chat the dashboards. I also really like your dashboards. I think it's a really nice way of visualizing things where you can see these things are statistically significant, these things aren't. For those people that were wondering why some of the red numbers were maybe not higher than some that weren't red, was that a sample size thing going on there? Because some of the differences looked bigger, but they weren't coming out as red compared to others.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think a really good one to speak on that is the light goods vehicles. From us in Devon, and I think I saw it in the chat, there's been a real increase in gig economy work, Amazon vans, delivery drivers. We've seen that the proportion of traffic is increasing on those, and that's also reflected in the casualty stats as well. The reason that this probably wasn't a significant change, again, I would imagine, is due to the variance and to actually saying, whilst they increased significantly over these 10 years, when you're comparing that latest year to the previous year, there's only a difference of 1. So that's why it won't be a statistical flag on the latest year, yet you're seeing increases compared with your control period and your 10-year trend.
Very nice. Seeing a few more comments coming in the chat. Another question from me. if you could do one more thing than you're currently doing with stats to generate a bit of insight you're not currently getting, is there anything you're kind of itching to do?
Yeah, and I think I touched on this with the COVID issue. What I'm really fascinated on is the traffic flow data, not just vehicular data, but pedestrian and cycle data. And I know that our reporting and counting mechanisms have reduced with restricted budgets. But to me, if I can accurately say that cycle volumes have increased and cycle casualties have remained the same, I can then begin to say cycling is getting safer proportionally. That is the one data set that I'd love to include, especially in terms of our rural networks as well. I get wild claims from people saying that they know there's been 15 crashes at a particular junction where I've got record of none. So just getting an understanding on the flow of traffic and how that's impacting our crash records would be really, really useful for me. That's what I'd like to see.
Great. And then maybe one last question to finish. There's interesting
question from Matthew
from Morgan
as well. Yeah.
Is there a question from Matthew?
In the Q&A, there is. Yeah.
Is there another one in the Q&A that I've missed? Okay, well, I'm going to go to the one in the chat first. And maybe we'll have time to squeeze in the other one. So Morgan's raised an interesting point in the chat about comparing Stats 19 with different sources, seeing differences. How can we compare the trends? I guess maybe there's a question in there on data reliability. And obviously you're doing the stats test, you're getting significant differences. How do we account for maybe the uncertainty in that and the fact that those reporting trends are different from maybe hospital data or other data sources? Maybe when you validate the data, you see some different numbers coming out. Tell me a bit about that.
It's a great question. And I think it comes back again to sort of the first point that I tried to make, which was let's define the question and let's work out what data we have. And I have been through similar exercises, Morgan, where we compared with hospital data and saw that our figures weren't really matching. And this really prompted us then to get in contact with the police, the holders and owners of the data. And I haven't spoken about it today a huge amount, but we do a really large amount of internal validation of our data before it is put into our Power BI dashboards. So what this means is we're double checking with the police where they say there's been a serious crash and injury. Is that actually true? Has it turned out that they were ambulanced off in a neck collar, but they were only strained and the officer wasn't aware of that at the time? So what I would encourage is you to reach out to your local police force and to start politely challenging them on their data. I know that from my experience, there will be inconsistencies, there will be data missed, there will be errors, and there will be challenges. But without firstly understanding what you're missing, I don't really know how I would proceed. So it has to be, as I sort of mentioned earlier, a three-way comparison between what we have, what the DFT have, and what the police have, and why those differences are there. Are the police not sending you, I don't know, cycle crashes for whatever reason? And have you removed 20 medical episodes that the DFT weren't aware of after their cutoff point? Those are the types of things that could really skew your analysis, and you'd need to be aware of. So hopefully that sort of answers how you would go about that.
So thank you. I've seen Matthew's question in the chat. Similar kinds of things to what you were saying in terms of dealing with underreporting. Can stats testing help with that? Have you got any advice, etc.? I really want to respect people's time. In 30 seconds, is there anything that you'd say to Matthew's question, or maybe that's something we can follow up later?
In 30 seconds, I think I would say you have to consider your data set as it is. If it's going to be inaccurate and with errors, you need to just take that into account and make that clear to people. I think it has to be a consideration, but I wouldn't want it to prevent you from starting. I don't think you should do that. We know the shortcomings in Stats 19. It is a national statistic, however. It is used constantly in research, and I would recommend looking at some papers where they go over those limitations in Stats 19, because perhaps there are some that you haven't considered before.
Great, thank you. Talking of papers, Dan's put a great link in the chat about linking with healthcare data, so do have a look at that if you can. Great, thank you so much all for coming. That concludes part 2, covering a local authority perspective. Big thank you, Oscar, to you for coming along. Really appreciate you sharing your context with us. I'm sure many people benefited from that, and a few seemingly will be in touch with you by email after. Don't all jump at once. Right, parts 3 and beyond will be coming soon. Do look out for emails on those, where we'll dive a bit more into stats testing and stats modeling from some different perspectives. Potentially see some of you next week at the National Road Safety Conference. Look forward to that. Otherwise, stay safe. See you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.